In September of 2017, a cattle farmer in Randolph County, West Virginia, found what he believes was a dead dogman at his fence line. That is the part of this story most people stop at. What kept the farmer up at night, what drove him to build 14 years of documentation before he ever talked to anyone about it, was what the tracks in the clay on the forest side of his fence told him about what killed it. Something came out of the hollow below his south pasture, pursued the dogman to the wire, and left it there. Then it stood at the body for 9 minutes. Then it disabled the trail camera that was recording it. Then it walked back into the timber. There is footage from a trail camera mounted on a fence post in that same county that the man who owns it has never shown anyone. Not his neighbors, not the county extension agent who comes out twice a year to look at his cattle operation. Not even the game warden he has known for 15 years. The only person he ever told about it directly is a retired wildlife biologist who had spent the better part of 3 decades working in the Monongahela National Forest, and who, when Hal described what the camera captured, went quiet for a very long time and then said he was going to need to see it for himself. When Hal drove the footage over to the man's house outside of Elkins and played it on a laptop in the kitchen, the biologist watched it twice without saying a word. Then he closed the laptop and sat back in his chair and said there was nothing in any predator classification system he had ever worked with that matched what was on that screen. He said he did not know what it was. He said Hal should keep it to himself. That was 7 years ago. Hal agreed to let us describe what that camera documented because the thing that matters to him is not the footage of what killed the dogman. The thing that matters is the dogman itself, what he found at his fence line on a Tuesday morning in September, and what that evidence has implied about the stretch of Monongahela National Forest that backs up against the southern edge of his property. He has been farming that ground for over 25 years. He had been cutting the last hay of the season when his border collie came back from the tree line along the south fence acting wrong. She did not bark. She did not whine. She sat down at his feet and would not look back at where she had come from. Hal has had that dog for 9 years. He knows every register of her behavior. When she sits down and will not look, he pays attention. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. He finished the row he was cutting, parked the tractor, and walked the south fence with the dog trailing behind him, which she did reluctantly. He found the dogman about 200 yards from the corner post on the field side of the fence. We are going to call him Hal. That is not his real name. He asked us to change it, and when you hear what sits against his property line and what he has documented over the last 14 years, you will understand why a man with cattle and a mortgage and relationships inside a rural county of fewer than 30,000 people does not attach his real name to this kind of account. The location is real. The county is real. The forest behind his fence is real, and it is 200 yards from where he found what he found. Only the man is shielded. The description of what Hal found at that fence is where most people stop believing him, and it is also the part he remembers with the most precision. The way people remember things they spend years trying not to think about and end up thinking about constantly. The dog stopped about 15 feet out and would not come closer. Hal came closer. What he found was a large animal that had died within the past several hours, still in the grass along the base of the fence, back legs on the field side, the front of the body crumpled against the lower wire as if whatever it was had been in the process of crossing from the forest side when it went down. He has been around dead animals his entire life. He crouched down and looked at what was in his fence for a long time, trying to make it into something he recognized. The body mass was too large for any coyote or fox in the region, larger than any black bear he had ever found dead on the property. The limbs were wrong. The rear legs structured like a canine's digitigrade, built to push off the ground in a way that carries the body upright rather than along it. The fur was dense and dark, nearly black across the back, with a brindle pattern through the flanks he had never seen on any dog or wolf. The skull was elongated, the muzzle extended forward more than a dog's, but set on a head broader through the temples, the ears large and bat-shaped, folded in death but clearly designed to stand erect. The teeth where the lip had pulled back were wrong for a domestic dog, wrong for a wolf. The canines too long, the carnassial teeth too massive for any animal of this region. Hal did not touch it. He photographed it with his phone. He photographed the fence where the body was crumpled against the lower wire. He photographed the ground on both sides of the fence. And then he noticed what the ground on the forest side of the fence was telling him. And that is where the story stops being about what he found dead in his field and starts being about what killed it. The soil along the fence line on the Monongahela National Forest side is clay over shale, and it holds impressions well when it is damp, which in September in Randolph County it usually is. What Hal found in the clay on the forest side of his fence was a track sequence that began about 30 yards into the tree line and ended at the fence. He followed them backward, away from the fence and into the timber. The tracks he was following were not from the animal that was dead in his grass. They were from something else. They were larger. The stride between impressions was longer than Hal had ever measured on any animal. He has been tracking deer and predators on this property for over 2 decades, and he understood the mechanics of stride analysis. He measured 2 of the impressions with a folding rule he kept in his jacket pocket. Each print ran just over 9 inches tip to claw. The stride between consecutive tracks of the same foot ranged from 58 to 62 inches at a pace that the track pattern indicated was not a full run but something between a trot and a loping walk. The depth of the impressions suggested a body weight substantially greater than the animal dead at his fence. Whatever had come through that tree line from the south, moving northeast toward his fence, had done it at a pace that was deliberate but not hurried. It knew where it was going. That animal had not died at the fence. It had died on the way to the fence. The track evidence on the forest side of the wire showed a second set of prints that matched the feet of the dead animal. Smaller, more canine, with a tread pattern consistent with a creature moving fast on 2 legs, sprinting toward the fence from further inside the tree line. The 2 track sequences converged approximately 18 yards from the wire. What happened at the convergence point Hal found in the state of the ground: a torn section of soil, gouged and displaced, leaf litter scattered, a sapling about 2 inches in diameter snapped off at mid-height with the break still white and fresh, bark hanging. Whatever happened at that spot happened fast, and it happened hard enough to tear the ground and put enough force on a 2-inch sapling to break it clean. The dead animal had crossed those 18 yards to the fence after the confrontation, had hit the fence at a crawl, and had not made it over. Hal stood in his field for a long time. His dog would not come past the fence line to join him on the forest side. He walked back to his equipment shed and called the game warden he knew, a man he had worked with over the years on the coyote and bear problems that come with running cattle adjacent to national forest land. The game warden came out that afternoon. He looked at the animal, he looked at the tracks, he took photographs. He spent 45 minutes in the tree line following the track evidence. When he came out, he told Hal that the dead animal was consistent with descriptions of a large unknown canid that had generated 3 other reports from Randolph and Pocahontas counties over the previous 6 years. He said he was going to submit the photographs and measurements to the state's Division of Natural Resources office in Elkins. He said he would keep Hal's name out of it. He said he was not going to pretend he knew what made the larger prints, but that based on the size and the stride and the way the ground looked at the convergence point, he was treating it as a large, unknown predator, and advising Hal to keep his cattle out of the south pasture until further notice. The report went in. The DNR office in Elkins received it, logged it under unclassified wildlife incident, and sent back a response 2 weeks later that attributed the dead animal to a large domestic dog, possibly a wolf-dog hybrid that had been killed by a black bear. Hal kept the photographs. He still has them. The game warden, who is now retired and no longer in a position where a wildlife incident report could affect his career, told us this year that he never believed the bear explanation, and that he specifically noted in his original submission that the larger prints were not consistent with any bear species native to West Virginia. The DNR's response did not address the larger prints at all. What follows from here is the story of the 14 years of evidence Hal has accumulated from the southern boundary of his property, from before the morning he found that body in his grass all the way through last season. It is a story built on trail cameras and handwritten logs and the testimony of one neighbor, a woman named June, who owns the property adjacent to the east and who has her own reasons for understanding what sits in the Laurel Fork drainage behind both their fence lines. It is not a comfortable story, and it does not resolve cleanly. But it is the most thoroughly documented case of dogman activity in the Central Appalachians that we have encountered, and the footage at the center of it, the footage Hal has never shown anyone except that retired biologist outside Elkins, is the reason we are telling it now. Randolph County, West Virginia, is the largest county in the state by land area, covering just over 1,000 square miles of some of the most vertical terrain in the eastern United States. The Allegheny Mountains run north to south through the county like a spine, and the ridges and hollows they create are stacked on top of each other from elevations of about 1,800 feet in the valley floors to over 4,000 feet on the highest ground. 176,000 acres of the county belongs to the Monongahela National Forest, the only national forest entirely within West Virginia's borders. Randolph is its headquarters county, and the Greenbrier Ranger District, based out of Bartow, manages the Laurel Fork North and South Wilderness areas, two designated roadless tracts split by Randolph County Route 40, that together cover nearly 12,000 acres of high-elevation terrain along the Laurel Fork of Cheat River. Hal's property sits at the end of a gravel road off Route 40 on the eastern edge of the agricultural valley that runs between the wilderness boundaries. The pastures run about 300 acres, with the south end bordered by a woven wire fence that Hal has repaired section by section over 25 years. On the other side of that fence, the national forest begins. The Laurel Fork drainage cuts southeast through mixed hardwoods and hemlock stands along the creek bottoms, with red spruce at the higher elevations. The terrain drops sharply from the forest boundary into the hollow, which means the tree line along Hal's south fence is the top edge of a slope that runs 300 feet down to the creek before climbing again on the far side of the drainage. The forest behind Hal's fence is not a gentle edge of woods, it is a wall. When you stand at the south fence and look into the timber, you are looking down into darkness that the canopy closes over within 30 yards of the wire. Elk moved into Randolph County in numbers starting in the mid-1990s after the state's reintroduction program, and the herd that uses the Laurel Fork area has grown substantially. Black bears are common across all of Randolph County. Bobcats move through the south pasture a few times each year. White-tailed deer are dense in the corridor between the forest boundary and the creek bottoms. Eastern coyotes, the larger eastern variety that carries some wolf genetics from hybridization events in the upper Midwest and Ontario, run through the county in scattered packs. Gray wolves have not held a breeding population in West Virginia since before the Civil War, though dispersers from Great Lakes packs occasionally show up in trail camera surveys, and the DNR has documented individual wolf genetic signatures in scat samples from the Highlands counties a few times over the past 20 years. Hal is aware of all of this. He has been watching predators work the fence line for a quarter century. He knows what a black bear track looks like on his cameras at night, how coyotes move through an agricultural edge in autumn, what elk look like at 2 in the morning. He logs observations the way a methodical man logs things he cannot afford to misread, because misreading a predator situation on a cattle operation has consequences you measure in dead animals and lost revenue. He started logging because he was losing calves in the south pasture. He kept logging because the pattern of what he was finding did not match anything the county extension agent or the game warden could explain. The first trail camera Hal put on the south fence was a basic wild game innovations unit he bought at the farm supply store in Elkins, a passive infrared model that triggered on motion and heat. He mounted it on a fence post about 40 yards west of the corner post that marks the southwest corner of the property, aimed into the timber on the forest side of the wire. His reasoning was simple. Whatever was taking calves was coming over the fence from the south, and he wanted to know what it was and when it crossed. He pointed the camera into the forest because he wanted to see what was approaching before it reached the fence. For the first 3 weeks, the camera captured deer, a black bear that came to the fence and stood up against the wire before wandering off, and 2 coyotes that trotted along the forest edge about 60 yards from the camera. Then, on a Wednesday night in late October, the camera captured something it was not built to explain. The trigger fired sometime after 1 in the morning. The image was infrared. In the lower portion of the frame, about 35 yards from the fence, something was standing. Hal had hung a surveyor's orange flagging tape on a branch at the 5-foot mark on one of the trees in the camera's field of view. Whatever was in that image cleared the flagging by what he estimated at 18 to 24 inches. The silhouette was wrong for a bear. Bears are bottom-heavy. What was in this image was heavy through the shoulders and chest, with legs that carried the body upright in a posture that matched no bear Hal had ever photographed. The head shape was canine in profile, a muzzle extending forward from the skull, large ears set high. It was standing directly in front of the camera, facing it, and based on the geometry of the head position and the camera angle, it was looking at the camera. Hal says he sat in his kitchen with that image on his laptop for a long time. His wife, who has since passed on from cancer, came downstairs and looked at the screen and said she did not want to know what that was, and that she thought they should move the camera somewhere else. He moved the camera. He put it on the field side of the fence, pointed back at the wire from his side. Whatever was in the timber was welcome to keep the timber side. For the next 2 years, the south fence cameras captured irregular but repeated images that fit the same general profile. Large, bipedal, canine-headed, appearing in the infrared as hot signatures moving through the timber at the base of the slope. Always between 11 in the evening and 3:30 in the morning. Always below the ridge in the hemlock stands, never crossing the fence. The images were not crisp, but across 2 years of documentation, 12 separate triggering events showed a consistent profile in a consistent location, behaving in a consistent pattern. Hal logged each one. He noted on 4 occasions that the subject appeared to be standing still and facing the camera, which was not the behavior of any deer, bear, coyote, or elk he had ever captured on those cameras. No report went to the DNR. Hal had been farming this county his entire adult life. He knew what happened to farmers who filed wildlife reports about things the DNR could not classify. The form went in a drawer. The game warden came out, found no immediate threat to livestock, and the matter closed without resolution. He had watched that happen to 2 other farmers in the county, one with a predator problem on his sheep operation, one with a series of trail camera images that the extension agent attributed to a large feral dog before anyone looked closely at the leg morphology. Hal's logs were his own record, kept for his own understanding of what was using the land adjacent to his fence. In the spring of the 5th year of documentation, the behavior changed. The first indication was fence damage along the south pasture line, not the usual barbed wire stretch from deer jumping and not the woven wire distortion a black bear produces. These were sections where the wire had been pulled outward from the field side, as if something had gripped the top of a fence section from the pasture side and pushed against it, testing whether it would give. It was stretched and deformed at a height of about 5.5 feet, and the ground below the deformed section showed impressions Hal photographed and logged with the note: bipedal canine morphology, estimated shoulder height approaching 6 feet. He filed these incidents as livestock predation insurance claims under unknown large predator. Keeping his insurance current while keeping him out of a conversation he was not prepared to have. The fence incidents were significant not because they indicated aggression toward his cattle, which remained undisturbed through this period. They were significant because of the pattern. 3 separate sections of the south fence showed the same type of deformation, spaced about 100 yards apart across a total frontage of roughly 200 yards of fence line. Whatever was pushing on the fence was doing it along a specific section of the boundary, not randomly. It was testing a specific portion of the wire, returning to the same locations, and doing it in a way that was consistent with an animal checking whether a boundary would hold, rather than trying to get through it. Hal interpreted this correctly, he thinks now, as territorial behavior, not aggression toward him or his cattle, but an assertion of interest in the section of ground on the forest side of the fence that happened to border his pasture. Something was making sure the wire was still there. June's property starts at the eastern corner post of Hal's south fence and runs east for about a mile before the forest boundary curves north. She inherited the land from her parents and runs a small hay operation on the fields, selling rounds to local cattle farmers, including Hal, in dry years. She is in her mid-50s, has lived on that ground her entire life, and has the kind of practical knowledge of a working farm landscape that comes from spending 50-plus years watching the same tree lines and creek drainages through every season. She agreed to talk because Hal vouched for her to us, and because she has been carrying her own observations for over a decade and has her own reasons for wanting the information to exist somewhere beyond her own memory. Her introduction to what Hal was tracking came in the winter of the same year the fence incident started. She had been cutting hay stubble in her east field, the one that backs against the forest about half a mile east of Hal's corner post, when she saw something moving at the tree line in early afternoon. She thought it was an elk. She stopped her tractor and watched. What she was watching walked out of the timber, crossed about 30 feet of open ground at the field edge, and re-entered the trees on a different angle on 2 legs. She watched for what she estimates was 25 to 35 seconds, very large, dark-coated, moving with a long-strided, forward-leaning gait, and when it entered the tree line it went down to all fours and was gone in an instant, the transition so fluid it looked like a single movement. She sat on her tractor for a long time after it was gone. Then she called Hal. They compared notes for the first time that winter. Hal showed her his trail camera images and his logs. June pulled out her own records, not as systematic as Hal's, but a series of notebook pages where she had been writing down unusual observations from her property since roughly the same time Hal started his documentation, prompted by a sighting of her own that she had never told anyone about, and that had preceded his fence camera work by about 18 months. Her first observation had been a set of tracks she found crossing the wet ground along the creek at the eastern edge of her property one morning in the fall. Tracks that did not match any animal she had ever seen on the land, that showed a bipedal gait pattern and a foot size she measured at 7.5 to 8 inches with her boot sole as a reference. She had not told anyone because she knew what the explanation would be and she did not want to be that person. Between them, comparing separate documentation from adjacent properties over several years, a pattern emerged with geographic consistency that neither could dismiss. The activity concentrated in the section of the Laurel Fork drainage directly behind the southern boundary of both properties, a stretch of maybe 3/4 of a mile of fence line above a hollow Hal's family had called Kettle Run, after the small spring-fed creek that ran through the bottom on its way to the main Laurel Fork. Even in full winter, the hemlock canopy over the creek bottom held darkness well into the morning. The terrain below the fence was steep enough that hikers rarely came that way, preferring gentler grades along the main Laurel Fork corridor miles to the west. You could stand on the fence line above it and hear nothing from any road or structure. In 25 years of farming the boundary, Hal had never seen another person in that hollow. If you have hunted or hiked in the Laurel Fork area of Randolph County or anywhere in the back country between the Greenbrier Ranger District boundaries and the high ridges above the Dry Fork drainage, you know the kind of terrain I am describing. Country where the ridges come down steep into creek bottoms so tight and dark that the sound of your own footsteps changes quality. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there, because the reports that have come to our attention from this section of the Monongahela National Forest go back further than Hal and June's documentation, and they are consistent in ways that are difficult to explain. The year Hal found the body at the fence was the year everything changed in terms of what he thought he was dealing with. He had spent 11 years assuming with decreasing confidence that the things in Kettle Run Hollow were a population of large, unknown canids. Unusual, scientifically significant if anyone with the credentials and the willingness would look at his evidence, but ultimately biological rather than something outside any classification system he understood. The body changed that assumption. The evidence at the fence that morning changed it, not because of what was dead in his grasp, but because of what the tracks on the forest side of the wire told him about the scale and nature of whatever had put it there. He had documented DOGMAN for over a decade without seeing direct evidence that anything preyed on them. They marked territory. They tested fences. They moved through the hollow at night with a consistency that suggested deep familiarity with the terrain. They never crossed into his pasture. They had killed calves in the early years before he understood the pattern, and he is still not certain those kills were from the creatures he had been documenting or from the coyotes that also worked the same edge. The DOGMAN, as he understood the behavioral profile from his cameras, was territorial and cautious and intelligent in ways that made it difficult to frame as a simple predator. It tested the fence but did not breach. It appeared and disappeared with a regularity that suggested not just an individual animal, but a population with consistent behavior over time. And now one of them was dead in his field, killed by something larger, something that had pursued it from deeper in the hollow, caught it within sight of the wire, and left it at the fence as a body, not as prey because the carcass was not fed upon. The killing had been decisive, severe trauma to the neck and upper back, consistent with what Hal had seen in the game warden's examination. But the animal was left where it fell. Predators kill to eat. Territory disputes between pack animals can produce kills, but they follow their own logic and occur within a species. What he found at the fence line was the result of a confrontation between two different things. One of them the DOGMAN he had been documenting for over a decade, and the larger thing that had come from deeper in the hollow and killed it before it could cross the wire. 4 cameras were running on the south fence. 3 captured nothing on the night before he found the body, which was itself unusual because a confrontation that tore the ground and broke a sapling should have triggered every camera in the area. The 4th, mounted on the corner post at the southwest boundary, had triggered twice in the early morning hours. The first triggering showed the body of the DOGMAN already on the ground against the fence, confirming the confrontation had happened before the first trigger. The second, about 20 minutes later, showed the fence line empty, and between those 2 triggers there was a period of approximately 9 minutes during which the camera's motion detector was being continuously activated, meaning a presence was holding position in detection range for 9 consecutive minutes, and yet the camera produced no image during that time. The camera's imaging function had been disabled, not the motion detection, which continued to log activations, just the imaging circuit. When Hal took the camera apart 2 days later to understand what had happened, he found that the infrared emitter array, the row of LEDs at the top of the unit that produce the light the sensor uses to capture nighttime images, had been physically pressed back into the housing until the connection broke. Pressure had been applied to the front face of the camera with enough force and enough precision to disable the imaging while leaving the motion detector running. To do that, it would have had to know which part of the camera did what. Hal sat in his truck with the disassembled camera on the seat next to him for a long time. The motion log said something had stood within range of his camera for 9 minutes in the middle of the night at the same fence post where a dead DOGMAN was lying on the ground 6 feet away. It had stood there long enough to understand that the camera was capturing it, and then it had pressed the imaging array back into the housing and left. That afternoon, Hal drove to Elkins and called the retired wildlife biologist he knew. He told him what he had found. The biologist asked him to bring the camera and the images he had. They met at the biologist's house outside of town, and Hal brought the disassembled camera and the images on a thumb drive and the pages from his log that covered the previous 11 years of documentation. The biologist spent 2 hours with it. He asked questions, he looked at the track measurements in the log, he looked at the photographs of the deformed fence sections. He looked at the trail camera images going back to the first one, the infrared silhouette against the flagging tape. He looked at the image of the dead animal and the photographs Hal had taken of the track sequence in the clay on the forest side of the fence. And then Hal showed him the footage. The footage that was not on the trail cameras that the biologist did not know about yet, that Hal had captured on a dash cam he had installed in his farm truck 3 months earlier after a series of unusual incidents on the gravel road that runs from Route 40 down to his property. He had been driving back from Elkins on a night in June, taking the county road slow because the gravel was wet, when his headlights caught something crossing the road about 150 yards ahead of him. It crossed fast, faster than a deer, on 2 legs with a long reaching stride that covered the road, which at that point runs about 18 feet wide between the ditches in 4 steps. He estimated the crossing time at under 2 seconds. He did not stop the truck. He drove past the point where it had crossed and did not look into the woods on either side. He drove to his house and sat in the kitchen and eventually went to bed and did not sleep. The next morning he found the dashcam unit he had ordered online 3 months earlier and had not yet installed. And he installed it that morning. He had ordered it after 2 previous nighttime drives home, where he had seen movement on the road that he could not identify. He had not installed it because he was afraid of what it might capture. It captured what it captured 2 months later in August, on a night when he was bringing the truck back from a neighbor's property where he had been helping move hay equipment. The road was dry. He was moving faster than usual, about 25 miles per hour on a road that warranted maybe 15 in the dark. The dashcam captured what crossed at the same point in the road, or close to it. And it captured it clearly enough that the biologist outside Elkins could not explain it, and clearly enough that Hal has never shown it to anyone else, and clearly enough that the biologist's only advice was to keep it to himself and be careful about who he told. He was careful. For 7 years he was careful. And now he is telling us. Not because he wants to go public in a way that draws attention to his property, which he still farms, which he still lives on, and where he still has cattle that he cannot afford to lose and a dog that will not walk to the south fence. He is telling us because he is in his early 60s and the documentation he has been keeping for 14 years deserves to exist somewhere beyond his own composition notebooks. And because the pattern he has documented in the Laurel Fork drainage of Randolph County, West Virginia, is the kind of pattern that should be known before someone who does not know what he knows walks into that hollow looking for a good camping spot. What the dashcam footage shows is what we will describe now, in the way the biologist described it after he watched it twice at his kitchen table in Elkins. The biologist is not given to dramatic language. He spent decades in the field identifying predators by their spoor and their behavior and their kills. He watched the footage and then he described it the way a man describes something he cannot classify but cannot dismiss. That description is what follows. The camera catches the subject entering the road from the south side at a speed the biologist estimated at somewhere between 25 and 30 miles per hour. The subject is upright, fully upright, head carried slightly low, arms moving in a counterbalancing motion. The height is clear relative to the fence posts visible on both shoulders of the road. It is carrying its head above the top of a standard cattle fence post while running in a forward lean, putting the full standing height well above 6 feet. The build is heavy through the chest, the legs clearly digitigrade, heel never contacting the ground. The foot pushes off the ball in each stride in a motion the biologist identified as characteristic of large carnivora. The fur is dark. The head, visible for a fraction of a second as the subject crosses the headlights, is canine in profile. Muzzle prominent, ears erect. It crosses the road in 4 strides and is gone. The biologist told Hal he had spent over 30 years studying predator populations in the Monongahela National Forest and knew every large-bodied canid species in North America by its track pattern, its gait, and its kill sign. He said the subject on that dash cam was not a wolf, not a domestic dog, not a bear, not a human in any kind of gear or costume because the gait mechanics did not allow for it. The gait pattern was consistent with a large-bodied digitigrade mammal running bipedally as its natural mode of locomotion. He did not know what it was. He had 2 or 3 experiences over 30 years in the Monongahela that he had never filed in any report, and that the dashcam footage was consistent with those experiences. He said Hal should keep it to himself. Then he closed the laptop and poured coffee and changed the subject. The retired biologist's advice was not to stop looking. He said, "Do not share this publicly." He did not say there was nothing to find. Complicated implies there is something to complicate. Hal drove home from Elkins that afternoon with a clearer sense than he had ever had that the 14 years of documentation in those notebooks was evidence of something real. Not a classification error, not misidentified wildlife, not a combination of bears and shadows and wishful thinking, but a real thing that had been using the hollow below his fence line for as long as he had been farming the boundary, possibly longer, and something larger than the dogman that had come from deeper in the hollow and killed it. That is what Hal cannot reconcile, and what the biologist could not reconcile, and what the 14 years of trail camera documentation and handwritten logs does not resolve: the hierarchy. The dogman, as Hal had come to understand it from his cameras and his logs, was not a passive creature. It tested boundaries. It disabled cameras. It held position in the dark for 9 minutes while something dead lay 6 feet away. These are not the behaviors of prey. They are the behaviors of something at the top of a local food chain that has learned to manage its relationship with the human activity on the other side of a wire fence. But something had killed one, efficiently and without feeding on it, and had come from deeper in the hollow to do it. Hal went back through his logs looking for anything that predated the body. He found it. In the 3 years before the body, there were 6 separate occasions when his cameras captured the dogman on the forest side of the fence appearing to look back into the hollow rather than at the fence or the field. Not the usual posture, which was to face the camera or to move parallel to the fence, but turned away from the wire, facing the slope that descended into Kettle Run below. On 2 of those occasions, the motion logger recorded a second triggering event within minutes of the first, but the camera captured no second subject. The first subject had moved away from the fence before the second trigger fired. In Hal's log notation at the time, second trigger unclear, possible camera malfunction. Not camera malfunction, he understands now. The dogman had moved before the second thing got into camera range. It had been aware of it. For at least 3 years before the killing, the dogman at the fence was already monitoring something in the hollow below its position. A presence that made it turn away from the familiar wire and face the dark slope it had come up. The body at the fence was not the beginning of the confrontation between these 2 things. It was the end of it, or the beginning of the end, or a single event in a longer territorial dispute that Hal had been partially documenting without recognizing what he was looking at. This is the architecture of the evidence that the biologist sat with at his kitchen table in Elkins. Not just the dashcam footage, which was remarkable on its own. The full 11 years of documentation that preceded it, the way the camera record changed over time, the behavioral shifts that made retrospective sense once you understood that the hollow below the fence line was not being used by one category of animal, but by at least 2, and that the relationship between them was not stable. The Shawnee and the Lenape, the Delaware, both used the Allegheny Highlands of what is now Randolph County as hunting ground through most of the 1700s, before pressure from colonial settlement and war pushed them west across the Ohio. The documentary record of their presence in this specific section of the highlands is not extensive because these were hunting parties rather than settled communities, And they did not leave the kind of archaeological footprint that established villages leave. But the Randolph County Historical Commission's published records note that the Shawnee used the Tygart Valley corridor as a major travel route, and the Laurel Fork drainage runs perpendicular to that corridor in a section the historical record describes as particularly productive deer and elk range. People moved through this ground. They camped in hollows like Kettle Run. They knew what lived in the forest here. Among the Lenape, the wolf clan called the Munsey or the Tuxeet by scholars of Lenape culture carried a wolf as their clan emblem with a relationship to wolfkind that ran deeper than symbol. The wolf clan people understood themselves as standing in a particular relationship to canine beings they recognized as real presences in the landscape. The French who encountered the Lenape in the colonial period called them the Loups, the wolves, because that association was so fundamental to Lenape identity that outside observers found it the most defining characteristic. The wolf clan's traditional territory included the stony highlands of the northeastern mountains, terrain that covered the Allegheny ridges of what is now West Virginia before the Lenape were pushed north and west. When the Lenape described beings in the deep forest that walked between two postures, that moved with purpose through territory they knew and humans did not, that required respect and distance, they were describing an animal tradition developed over generations of observation. Shawnee tradition of the wolf dance, documented by ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, treated wolves and wolf-related beings as powers that existed independently of human belief in them, and that had established relationships with specific territories over periods of time that dwarfed any individual human lifetime. When a Shawnee hunting party moved through a hollow like Kettle Run, the question they were asking was not whether wolf beings used this terrain. The question was how to move through terrain that was already occupied without provoking a response. The protocol was not fear, it was acknowledgement and respect. You moved through someone else's ground, and you signaled your awareness that it was someone else's ground, and you did not pretend otherwise. The European settlers who arrived in Randolph County in the late 1700s brought the assumption that wilderness was unoccupied until humans occupied it. The first German-descended families who settled the Tygart Valley built their farms at the edges of the same hollows the Shawnee had moved through for generations. The Laurel Fork drainage was logged beginning in the 1880s by the Laurel River Lumber Company, stripped bare and then acquired by the Forest Service over the following decades. The hemlock and hardwood Hal looks down into from his fence line is second growth. The oldest stands perhaps 80 to 90 years old. But the hollow is old. That creek is old. And what uses terrain is not dependent on the age of the trees above it. Godfrey documented a consistent behavioral pattern across DOGMAN reports from the Great Lakes region over 30 years. One pattern she noted repeatedly was the association between DOGMAN activity and areas that had been logged or otherwise disrupted, then allowed to recover. Reports clustered in transition zones, habitat returning to forest rather than undisturbed old growth. The Laurel Fork Wilderness, designated in 1983 as exactly this kind of transitional zone, wilderness in the sense of being returned to wildness after industrial extraction rather than never having been touched. The behavioral pattern Hal documented is consistent with a population that moved back in as the timber grew back, and the logging railroad was removed and the hollow went quiet. The Steve Cook radio prank of 1987 generated reports from northern Michigan describing exactly this kind of terrain. River bottoms, logged over second growth, transitional forest along the margins of agricultural land. The basic configuration, a hollow with water adjacent to farm ground, edged by recovering second growth forest in a county where large areas go unwatched for months, is the same one that produced the Lake County, Michigan documentation. The behavioral profile Hal documented with its camera awareness and fence testing and infrared posture that suggested active observation matches the Pine River behavioral record more closely than coincidence allows. Hal does not know Russ. He had never heard of the Pine River documentation before we spoke to him. When we described the Lake County behavioral pattern, he listened quietly and then said it sounded exactly like what he had been watching in Kettle Run Hollow for 14 years. The camera avoidance, the territorial marking behavior, the way the subject would appear in a fixed location, face the camera for a period, and then step back into the timber before the next trigger. The pattern of fence testing at specific sections rather than along the full perimeter. These specifics are not general knowledge. They are not the behaviors that documentary film crews have captured or that wildlife biology textbooks describe. They are the behaviors of a real animal that has learned to manage its relationship with human territory in a way that draws on knowledge passed between individuals over time. 2 years after the body incident, Hal upgraded his camera system. He moved away from the passive infrared motion trigger units he had been using and invested in a cellular trail camera system. Units that uploaded images to a cloud server in near real time and that used active infrared rather than passive, which meant they could capture images without producing the visible glow that older passive infrared cameras emitted. He wanted to know if the camera avoidance behavior was specifically triggered by the visible illumination of the passive infrared LED arrays. If the subject was responding to the faint red glow the old cameras produced when their sensors fired, then concealing or eliminating that glow should change the detection rate. It did not change the detection rate. The cellular cameras were found and disabled at the same rate as the older units. 2 were rotated on their mounting brackets within 10 days. 1 was removed from its mount entirely, the strap still wrapped around the post but the camera on the ground 12 feet away. It had been lifted off. The upload log showed the camera operational until the early hours of its 3rd night, then dark. The last image it uploaded showed an empty fence line. The image that was not uploaded was still on the SD card when Hal found the camera on the ground. It showed a surface of dark fur, an articulated hand pressed against the camera housing, individual fingers, each visible as a distinct impression against the plastic. Hal kept that image on his phone. He showed it to us. We can describe it. The hand is large, larger than a human hand, the fingers proportionally longer relative to the palm, the knuckles distinct under the fur in a way that suggests substantial bone structure. The palm is pressed flat against the lower edge of the camera housing, thumb evident at the left margin of the frame, the other 4 fingers curling over the top. The fur across the back of the hand is dense and short, the same dark color he had photographed on the dead animal at the fence. The lighting is the camera's own active infrared, which means the hand is lit from the camera itself. A close-range self-portrait taken by a subject that had just pulled the camera off its mount and was, in the fraction of a second before the image uploaded to the server, looking at it. The biologist, when Hal showed him this image on a later visit, said nothing for a long time. Then he said the hand proportions were consistent with a large non-human primate. Then he said there were no large non-human primates native to West Virginia. Then he said he needed more coffee and got up from the table. What is the thing in the hollow? What killed the dogman at the fence? These are the questions Hal has been sitting with for 7 years, and he does not have an answer to either one. What he has is a behavioral profile built from 14 years of observation, a series of images, a piece of dashcam footage, a disassembled camera unit with a broken infrared array, and the testimony of his neighbor June, who has her own camera record documenting the same behavioral pattern from the adjacent property. He has the track photographs from the clay on the forest side of his fence, kept in a folder in his filing cabinet. He has the motion log from the disabled camera that shows 9 minutes of continuous activation with no corresponding images, because the imaging circuit was pressed back into the housing by something that stood at his fence post in the dark for 9 minutes with a dead dogman at its feet and chose to disable the camera rather than leave. That choice is what he comes back to. He thinks about territory the way farmers think about it, as ground that has to be maintained and defended. But that also has to be managed in relation to what neighbors are doing on their side of the line. His south fence is the wire between his operation, and whatever lives in the hollow below. For 14 years, the relationship across that wire has been a managed one. The dogman tested the fence. The fence held. The cameras were found and disabled. The arrangement was imperfect but stable. Then something killed one of them at the wire, stood at the body for 9 minutes, disabled the camera, and left. And the hollow has been quiet ever since. Not the animated, territorial quiet of the early years, when the cameras picked up regular activity and the fence showed wear from testing. A different quiet, the quiet of a place where something has changed. Hal has not found a dead animal at his fence again. He has not found fresh fence damage in the south pasture in 5 years. The cameras he still runs, now 4 cellular units positioned at intervals along the south boundary, have captured normal wildlife in that time. Deer, bears, elk moving through in the fall, coyotes, the occasional fox. What he has not captured in 5 years of continuous cellular monitoring is anything that matches the behavioral profile he spent 11 years documenting. The hollow behind his fence is quiet in the way a hollow goes quiet when the thing that used it for a long time has moved on, or been moved on. He does not know if the dogman population in Kettle Run Hollow was displaced or simply retreated deeper into the drainage. He does not know if the thing that came up from the hollow and killed at his fence is still using the terrain, or whether it is gone too, or whether what happened at his fence line was the end of something that had been building between those two things over years of documented behavioral change. He does not know, and the retired biologist does not know, and the DNR's bear killed a large dog explanation accounts for none of what the cameras and the logs and the dashcam footage actually show. What Hal does know is what June told him the spring after the incident, when the hollow had been quiet for 6 months. She had come across a reference in the Randolph County Historical Commission's materials to an account from an early German settler family that established a farmstead in the Laurel Valley in the 1790s. Recorded in the 1850s by a descendant, it described a conversation the original settler had with a Shawnee hunter near the creek drainage south of the family's cleared fields. The hunter said the hollow below the settlers' new fields had been a place the Shawnee avoided in certain seasons, because something used it that had been using it since before the Shawnee's grandfathers were alive, and the respectful course was to move around it rather than through it. The settler had not asked what the thing in the hollow was. He cleared his fields north of the drainage and stayed out of the low ground to the south. His farm had been productive. Hal read that account and recognized it as the oldest version of what he had spent 14 years learning. Move around it rather than through it. Stay north of the wire. Let the hollow be what it has been and what it will be after the current generation of farmers and wildlife managers and DNR staff and biologists is gone, and the forest has another 100 years on it. Whatever lives in the Laurel Fork drainage has been there longer than any of them. It managed the logging era by retreating and returning. It has managed the National Forest designation by existing in the terrain the wilderness boundary encloses, terrain that sees fewer human visitors per year than any comparable wilderness in the eastern United States. It will manage whatever comes next. The institutional silence around what Hal has documented is not a conspiracy. The DNR's response to the game warden's incident report was not the result of anyone deciding to hide the truth. It was the result of a system with a predator classification database and no internal mechanism for acknowledging that a large unknown canid with bipedal locomotion capability is using terrain inside the Monongahela National Forest. The wildlife incident form has fields for black bear, coyote, eastern coyote, white-tailed deer, elk, gray wolf. When a report describes a dead animal that does not fit any of those fields, the system assigns the closest available fit. The closest available fit for a large unknown canid killed by an even larger unknown predator in a county where black bears are abundant was Bear Kills Domestic Dog. Nobody chose to lie. The form did not have a field for the truth. Managing over 300,000 acres of Pocahontas and Randolph County land, The Greenbrier Ranger District sees a few thousand visitor days per year in the Laurel Fork Wilderness, concentrated in summer and fall. The rest of the time, the hollow below Hal's fence is managed the way all designated wilderness is managed. Minimal intervention, the expectation that the designation itself is sufficient protection. Nobody is conducting wildlife surveys in the deep sections of Kettle Run Hollow. The wilderness designation in practice means that nobody goes in with machinery or roads, and in some sections it means nobody goes in at all. This is the condition under which something has been using that hollow for as long as the historical record extends, and probably longer. The absence of human presence is the prerequisite for its continued presence. The wilderness designation, whatever its intent, functions in the Laurel Fork drainage as a land use decision that benefits the creatures inside it. The trees can grow, the creek runs clean, the terrain stays rough enough that casual visitors do not penetrate the lower hollows. And whatever has been marking territory at Hal's south fence has the terrain it needs on the other side of the wire. The question June brought up the last time she and Hal talked about the hollow was not what the Dogman is or what killed it. The question she raised was simpler and harder. She said, if something killed a Dogman at the fence and then stood at the body for 9 minutes and disabled the camera and left, and if the hollow has been quiet since, what does that mean for what comes next? Is the hollow empty? Is the thing that killed it still there, now the primary occupant? Is it a better neighbor than the Dogman was, given that the Dogman tested fences and this thing has not? Or is the quiet itself the answer, something in the hollow watching the fence line and the cameras and the farmer on the other side deciding that the fence is sufficient and the situation is stable and nothing further needs to happen? Hal said he did not know. He said that was the question he went to sleep with most nights and woke up with most mornings, and that after 7 years of quiet from the south pasture he had arrived at something between peace and wariness. He had stopped thinking of the hollow as something to be understood and started thinking of it the way the Shawnee hunter had described it to the settler 200 years ago. It belongs to something that has been there longer than the fence. The fence is a courtesy. As long as both sides respect the courtesy, the arrangement works. He still farms the property, his cattle are healthy, his hay operation is solid, his border collie, now old and slow and arthritic in her back legs, still will not go past the south fence line, and Hal has stopped asking her to. He checks his cellular camera uploads every morning from his kitchen. The cameras show him deer and bears and elk and coyotes and the occasional bobcat moving through the field side of his fence line in the ordinary patterns of Randolph County wildlife. They have not shown him in 5 years anything moving on the forest side of the wire in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning. The motion logs are quiet in those hours. The upload records show no activity. He does not take that quiet to mean the hollow is empty. He takes it to mean the hollow is managed by something that understands the fence, understands the cameras, understands the farmer on the other side of the wire, and has decided that what is needed is nothing more than quiet. The same thing the Shawnee hunter told the settler in the 1790s. The same principle that informed the original decision of whoever put the first wire along the south boundary of this property. Some ground belongs to what was there first. The wire marks the edge of what Hal can reasonably claim. The hollow marks the edge of what something else can reasonably ask him to respect. The dashcam footage is still on a hard drive in Hal's house in Randolph County. The trail camera images go back 14 years. The composition notebooks sit in a filing cabinet in the equipment shed, the pages smelling of the dust and hay chaff that gets into everything on a working farm. The hand image from the cellular camera is still on Hal's phone. He has not deleted it. He told us one more thing before we ended our conversation. He said that in the spring of last year, working the south pasture on a warm evening in April, he had seen something at the tree line. Not on the cameras. With his own eyes from the seat of the tractor at a distance he estimated at about 150 yards. A shape at the edge of the timber at the point where his south fence meets the forest boundary. It was standing upright, partially screened by a stand of young poplar, and it was watching the tractor. He kept driving. He did not stop the row he was cutting. He did not pick up his phone. He did not look directly at the tree line for the remainder of that pass. When he came around on the next pass, the shape was gone. He said the only thing he felt in that moment was the same thing he had felt every time in 14 years. That the evidence told him he was being observed from the other side of the wire. He said the word for it was not fear exactly. It was the feeling you get when you understand your own position accurately. You are a farmer on the north side of a fence. There is something on the south side that has been there longer than the fence, longer than the farm, longer than the county and the forest designation and the logging era and the settler history all stacked together. It knows you are there. It knows your schedule. It knows your cameras and your truck and your dog and your fence line and the particular reach of your cellular signal and the fact that your camera uploads every motion event to a server in another state. It has been incorporating that knowledge into its decisions about how to manage the border between your ground and its ground for as long as you have been watching. And it has decided for now that the fence is enough. Whether it stays enough, whether the quiet that has settled over the south pasture in the last 5 years is permanent or provisional, whether whatever lives in the Laurel Fork drainage is done at Hal's fence or is simply waiting, he does not know. He has stopped expecting to know. He manages his cattle and cuts his hay and checks his camera uploads and lets the hollow be the hollow. Some questions do not have resolutions. Some ground belongs to something that was there first, and the best you can do is acknowledge the wire between you and it and not pretend the wire means more than it does. The hollow is still there. The Laurel Fork Wilderness is still there, 12,000 acres of designated roadless terrain in the Greenbrier Ranger District of the Monongahela National Forest, split by County Route 40, bounded on the north by the farms that have been working this ground since the 1800s. Hal's fence still runs along the south edge of his pasture, the wire his grandfather put in, repaired section by section over 25 years. The creek still runs through Kettle Run Hollow. The hemlock stands along the creek bottom are a little taller than they were 14 years ago. The forest is still coming back, and whatever has been in that hollow since before the Shawnee hunter told a settler to move around rather than through it is still there, in the dark below the ridge on the other side of the wire, managing its own piece of ground in the way it has always managed it. Patient, aware, completely unbothered by our need to know what it is.